All right, Jacob. I know we talked a little bit before, and since you work at P3 before, so a lot of like basketball guys, like strength and conditioning coach, work in basketball world, know who you are. But like for those who are not familiar with you, can you like introduce yourself a little bit?
For sure, yeah. I wouldn't go so far as to say people know who I am and in the basketball space. I think P3 carries a bigger name than myself, and I'm happy to have been there and learned from them. But before P3, I did my undergrad and graduate training at the University of Tampa, did a lot of research in their human performance lab, and also worked with some athletes. While I was at the Tampa area, I was a performance science assistant with the Yankees for 2 years, and then I was at P3 for about a little over 4 years, doing a little bit of everything, helping with some training and doing some stuff on the biomechanics side as well, where I collected data for my dissertation. And then after P3, I now have been at Tonal for a little bit more than 2 years. So different environment than P3, but still, have my foot in a couple different environments with some external projects. So definitely yeah, I think that's a snapshot.
Nice, nice, nice. So, quick question, because like a few years ago, you guys like published a research about like lateral shuffle, and like now you have a new research talk about like uh overall like change direction. Um, do you always have passion to like doing research?
Me personally,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
oh yeah, very much so. I, as an undergrad, I walked into the research lab on the first day, and for me, it was just always I saw research as an opportunity to maximize my personal development and skill set, but then also the act of doing a research project is something I enjoy because of like the timelines associated with it. You get to like identify a specific problem. You learn as much as you can in that lit review, and then with your team of investigators, you try to isolate that problem like as much as you can, and you try to design an environment that can help you answer that problem, and you hope that problem can provide value to practitioners. So just that cycle is something I enjoy a lot, and I've been, happy to be a part of a couple of projects that are out there now. But me personally, it suits my, passion and skill set pretty well because you have to just focus on one thing for about 5 years in a row, and and that's what I
Nice,
like to do.
nice, nice. So, uh, before we talk about the new research, I know we kind of talked about the lateral shuffle a bit before, but still, uh, can I share like uh what are some main things or like some main takeaway for the lateral shuffle research?
You want me to share that, or
Yeah,
do,
yeah.
do you, oh, yeah, I think so. I think this was 2022 now. Eric Leidersdorf put out a paper from P3 where they wanted to see if um, lateral CMJ performance could differentiate performance in shufflers. It's a practical test very similar to a counter movement jump, and they want to see if have if you could differentiate lateral shuffling performance based off of kinetics from the CMJ test. So if you are above the median in shuffling performance, would you have higher lateral relative force outputs as well? And generally speaking, that's what we found when you look at faster shufflers compared to slower shufflers. They have about a 9% difference in relative lateral force in the skater, which is, practically relevant because as you know, being in the college now the pro environment, you're not going to be able to get someone to do a shuffle test every day. And on your end, you want to see if there's any, performance deficits that they might have. So if you can have a practical tool that you can get maximal effort in, like very similar to a counterment jump, it's something you can add to your repertoire to now very practically get information on vertical force performance and now lateral as well. And you have the understanding that this lateral test can maybe differentiate shuffling performance. And I think Eric's talked about this in a recent article, but vertical and lateral performance are also not directly correlated. So I think looking at those two tests together can give you a lot of valuable information.
Nice, nice. And like, what are some things that, uh, what are some things you like discover with the new research?
Yeah, so this new research was the that we just published is the first project from my dissertation. And the global dissertation is we were trying to understand or help practitioners, assess qualities that are relevant for sports. So we know that being able to accelerate and decelerate has both offensive and defensive implications for basketball. And so, because of that, practitioners in the field are constantly striving to find ways to practically assess these qualities, develop these qualities, and then ultimately transfer performance in these qualities. And on the assessment side, with the proliferation of force plates over the past decade, there's a growing body of research and on the training side, there's always going to be some nuance, but there's, these general consensus that, both strength training and plyometric training are good for developing these qualities for basketball. What's a bit unclear is the best way to monitor the transference from these assessments. So we know we have training methodologies that can improve performance in laboratory tests, but the crux of the paper is if you improve your uh, force plate kinetics by 15%, how much of that 15% actually transfers to you being able to decelerate and accelerate more effectively on the basketball court. And there's many reasons why it's hard to monitor transference, but with LPS systems and optical tracking systems, we can now get fairly reliable and valid measures of these people actually playing their sport and watching them accelerate and decelerate. So we saw that as an opportunity to try to measure this transference or really isolate a specific study. So that was sort of like the purpose of what we were trying to do.
Nice, nice. I remember like I think it's last year before me and Adam went on. I think is it before or after? I think it's after the trip. Me and Adam went on like 10 D1 par 4 school and we hop on a call talk about like you're also doing like research that correlate with deceleration and change of direction. So uh like what makes you want to do like research like correlate with deceleration or like change of direction?
Yeah, so that those were, there was two parts to our project. One is we wanted to see these, cross-sectional relationships. And it kind of went back to what you asked earlier about lateral shuffling performance you know, when you want to get insights into someone's, deceleration or maximum velocity capabilities, it's not very practical to bring them into a lab and say, sprint as fast as you can for 7 meters, stop as aggressively as possible, and then backpedal. While you, as a practitioner, that information on their maximum deceleration ability and their ability to reduce their momentum is critical. We wanted to see, is there a practical test that can give you insights into that quality? And other researchers have done that in the past. Damian Harper had one of the first papers, and I think now your colleague Nico had another paper on that. So the first part of our project here is we wanted to add to that body of literature. I think we had, 40 subjects, Division One and NAIA, and we wanted to see again, are there relationships between counter movement jump kinetics and deceleration performance? And then we also did that for the lateral counter movement jump and lateral shuffling performance as well. So that was sort of the first cross-sectional study that we did, and the one we just published was more of the transference. So we assessed those qualities in the lab and then we trained a cohort of those athletes. And then we wanted to see, okay, if you improve in these laboratory tests, how does that transfer to on court as well? So those were kind of like, the two different questions we were trying to ask. One was this, are these assessments correlated? And if they're not correlated, can they differentiate performance between fast and slow? And then also how those qualities change. So I can, go any direction you want from there, but that's sort of the framework of the four individual projects that we had. It's this vertical and horizontal, and then also looking at the lateral plane as well.
Nice, nice. I f correct me if I'm wrong, but like I feel like before the research me and Adam did and before the research you're doing, like there's not a lot like research compare like vertical versus like lateral and like linear. Am I correct? In terms of like deceleration or change of direction.
Um, yeah, I think what hasn't been done is a lot of the longitudinal stuff. So looking at how these qualities change after training. But I think there's been uh, some research that has looked at in basketball players specifically relationships between counter jump kinetics and deceleration performance. To my understanding, the paper Eric put out was the first that looked at it laterally. So in that on that side, yeah, you're right. I think there was I think Shimakochi, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, looked at, you know, kinetic differences in change of direction performance on its own, but that was, just sort of highlighting some of like the technical factors that impact your ability to change directions laterally. But I think Eric's paper was one of the first that looked at, the ability of a practical laboratory test to differentiate this. So there's now some literature in these spaces, but we tried to, just add to that because, there's not much.
Cool, cool. So, all right. So if I'm a strength coach, like I'm like reading your research, like like you mentioned, like improving these like testing, improving like force weight number, or improving like linear or like lateral change of direction. How does that help me with my basketball player?
Yeah. So what we found in this most recent project was that we identified changes in laboratory metrics. So we did a regression analysis and we wanted to see if changes in key laboratory metrics could explain the variance and changes in certain on-court outcomes. And it's pretty boring, but two of the key predictors that popped into some of these models were changes in jump height and changes in deceleration performance in that laboratory ADA test. And jump height was also the strongest correlate with approach velocity, and we also saw a significant relationship with deceleration performance cross-sectionally as well. So the big takeaway on that front is that, improving jump height, not only is it, associated with these performances, but it also, transfers to improvements in certain, especially your ability to accelerate is where we saw the greatest impact on that front. So what we also saw in our study was that we had a control group of just strength training only, and this experimental group of strength and plyometric training. And that combination of adding plyometric training resulted in greater adaptations in braking kinetics in the CMJ, and then also greater performance in decelerating in the lab. And then those changes did also transfer to improvements in on-court deceleration performance. So the main two takeaways from our study was that, you know, plyometric training has the ability to develop certain qualities that are more effective for transferring deceleration performance on court. And you can measure these in the CMJ. You can measure these qualities directly when you're decelerating in the lab, and then as well as on court.
Cool. So, uh, another question like related to this is these players like play basketball all the time, especially at this era, they literally have no rest, right? So like playing basketball game, they jump a lot, they run a lot, they do a lot of change of direction. So is there a need like I know I kind of already answered this, but like some coaches will say like they already did a lot of like plyometrics. Why do we still have to do it?
That's a important question, and I think it also touches on this like notion of the minimal effective dose for getting like desirable adaptations. And there was a meta-analysis by Pack, I think it came out in 2019, but they showed that you can see strength gains in trained individuals with just one heavy set. I think it was like between 70 to 85% of their 1RM 2 to 3 times per week. So the amount of loading that you need to see positive outcomes is not as much as the former, like, no pain, no gain mentality. And that's also true for like muscle growth as well. I think there was a new meta regression from, I think it was Robinson and colleagues at FAU, and they showed that 4 sets per muscle group per week is enough to stimulate muscle growth. So you have that in mind. So you don't need to overload these people, especially when they're getting so much work on court. But I do think it is important to sort of complement the stimulus they're getting on court. I think my response to a coach, if they said, my players are already getting all these, minutes and high intensity actions on court, I wouldn't do conditioning with them if I had them in the gym. But I don't think they're getting this like maximal motor unit recruitment that is really good for developing strength. Or maybe you can supplement some isometric activities to really sort of like help them maintain their tendons. And then depending on their minutes, I'm sure you can find a window within the week to do some aggressive plyometrics if they're capable and healthy, just so you're not, I don't know, I feel like a lot of people are trying to keep the wheels on as the season goes, but I think there's an opportunity to, continue to improve performance as well.
This is really cool because like while you're explaining your thoughts, something pop up in my head. Like I think it was like a few years ago, one of like the first two podcasts I did with Coach Boo Boo Schexnayder. And we were talking about like training for basketball player. He said he'll do like it's during the season, he'll do like I think max to like 17 like foot contact in terms of like maximal plyometrics, right? Like
Mm.
drop jump every 17 days or every like 2 to 3 weeks. And that will help them in terms of like change direction or like vertical jump height. And that's probably like exactly what you said, right?
Definitely, I think it's just being really targeted with exposing them to load, but I don't think the answer is not exposing them to some of these higher intensity loads. I think the key is making sure you have the right amount of volume. I think that's if they're, not in any pain and they are capable of undergoing some load, if you keep the intensity relatively high and the volume pretty low, you can still, develop these adaptations and not even just maintain. And if you do nothing, they're just going to go down. So I think that trend is, I'm not as involved on the team sport side, but I think most people are trying to do targeted high intensity loading throughout the season now. I think you'd probably know more than me on that front.
Cool. So, I guess this kind of go back to like when you work with P3, like you know how basketball player is. They don't like to lift. They don't like to like they always complain about knee pain, always complain about something. So when you kind of like collect these data, like how do you make sure they get effort into like these jumps? Because I remember when we go to like these schools, like we literally had to like jump them like probably like I don't know 2 3 times to get a like decent jump.
Yeah. I mean, for me, the most success I've had with teams and either doing research or training them, as it's come from the coach. If the coach values it, they that creates such a better environment for you. And the teams we worked with, the coaches helped like precede the players with like, hey, like this is going to help you prevent injuries throughout the season. It's going to help you improve your performance. And by the time they came to us in this environment for this project, they were already bought in, and that was the same during my time at Tampa as well. But for this project in particular, we did sit them down in the front, and I think at P3 they do this around the pre-draft cycle, but you just sort of say, hey, like we have a 6 week or an 8 week window to put some work in, and the entire staff here, like our number one focus is to put you in the best position you can be to have like an amazing season. And so we're gonna try to expose you to some work, and we're always going to have a conversation to make sure that you're feeling good and you're comfortable, but letting them know that you're on their side and you care for them and they're not just, an athlete mill and that you just are there putting work through, I think is, it helps to level set for sure.
Nice, nice. Because I've been part of like a few research project, and sometimes like you said, if you collect the data just to collect the data, they like the athlete will be like, I don't care, I don't give a fuck. But like
Yeah.
if you like kind of talk to them and tell them that I really care about them, they'll do what you said, right?
Yeah, and also like showing them on the back end too. Like when we collected the data, we had office hours, and I think more than half the people came in to sort of see not only their kinetics, but the video footage we have as well. And we can say, hey, these are some strategies we like, these are some strategies we didn't. So creating that space to sort of show them the why behind what you're collecting, but more broadly, I'm not here to say I'm the best at getting athlete buy-in, but I think you have to be really careful about the environment you set up when you are collecting data and the amount of, tests that you're asking them to do. And that's why I think the practical tests like the counter movement jump and the lateral counter movement jump are easy to get maximal effort in, and so you can have more confidence in the data. Where I know a lot of groups have like stopped doing RSIs because the athletes have buy-in in week 1 or 2, but by the end they just don't care, and that's why I'm optimistic about the approach we took with measuring on-court performance because once you get them in their environment and they're playing their sport and you create a little game and some competition, suddenly you're getting like maximal intent in these situations that are like very sport specific. And so now you can see not only in this lab environment, but you can see how are they accelerating and decelerating, like ultimately where it matters. And intent is everything. If you don't have intent in any research study, your data means nothing.
Yeah. So talk to me about this on-court performance, right? How do you, I mean, it's research. How do you quantify on-court performance?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. For us, I think the analogy is, if you look at a forced time curve of a counter jump, you see this clear differentiation between like the braking phase and the propulsive phase. And you can select metrics from each of those. And that has seemed to provide a lot of value to practitioners. And on the flip side, when you go on court, there's been, most D1 teams now have a Kinexon, they have a catapult, and everyone's doing workload monitoring. And there's some groups that are doing it well, but when you look at the literature as a whole, it felt like there wasn't the value for the time and like the resources that were being put in. And it seemed that people were starting to, there was a couple of projects that came before us where they were saying full game averages are not really representative of these critical components where games are won and lost. So then it went from, okay, maybe these full game averages aren't everything. And there were certain groups that were saying, we're going to look at the most demanding minute. So now you're going from a full game average down to a minute, and that seems to be a bit more relevant. But what we wanted to do, or the thought we had, is how many tactically relevant actions can occur within a single minute. So we tried to get back to that CMJ forced time curve and say, we're going to monitor not just the maximal velocity of a single action, but we're going to try to break down the accelerative and the decelerative components of a single relevant tactical action. Um, and we wanted to see if that would change over time. So if you got better if you got stronger, more powerful in the lab, that was sort of our test. If this method of segmenting a drill at the individual rep level was sensitive enough to see changes over time. And so that was sort of the concept and the drills that we developed to measure that. We had an offensive drill and a defensive drill. And for both of these drills, we had, a passive or a more standardized condition, and then we had a more open-end live condition. And on the offensive drill, we called it a drive and score. They were cued to accelerate maximally the offensive player with the ball. And then when they came into contact with the defensive player, they were supposed to decelerate as aggressively as they could, perform a crossover, and then re-accelerate to the basket. And then the defensive player in that passive condition, they were instructed to follow them for 2 steps, but not really try to take the ball away. And in the live condition, it's this one-on-one scenario where the offensive player could perform, any single attacking move of their choice, and the defensive player was trying to stop them maximally. So, it's not the same as collecting game data, but we tried to just, bring the lab test a bit more real world environment. And from those individual repetitions, we were able to look at the LPS data to sort of see uh, peak acceleration, maximum velocity, peak deceleration, average deceleration. And those were some of like the four key metrics that we looked at in both this offensive and this defensive drill.
Nice, nice. Man, this is awesome. So, uh, earlier you mentioned that you guys also used like a video to like kind of monitor their change direction strategy, right? So I remember back when we did our research, like after we collect the data, like coaches will call us like, why does like certain guys' numbers seems like average, but they're actually the best player they have? And why does
Mm.
like certain guys like their average their numbers like really good, but it's actually like probably not so good on like on court performance. So, and we need to like break down the film so we can understand like, oh, it's because like their strategy will like change of direction or their strategy like jumping is different, right? So I was just curious like how much like how much time you guys need to dedicate to like breaking down like film.
I think what like the question you just asked is really important. And it's one of the things that we found, and I think it's why, if you look at Damien's work, if you look at Nico's work, there's not these really strong relationships between a counter movement jump and a deceleration performance. And I think the reason why that is exactly what you said. You can have someone who's great at jumping, but their technique when it comes to decelerating is really poor. So when you do a Pearson correlation, like that person's data points are going to be here, but the opposite's also true. You can have someone who's not great at jumping, but they have really great body positioning when it comes to decelerating. So ultimately, I think as a practitioner, it's exactly what you said. You have to ideally you have both of these inputs. You have, the kinetics and the kinematics, and then you can identify from that, okay, you can tell the coach, hey, like this guy has the engine, force capacity wise, both eccentrically and concentrically, vertically and laterally, like the raw material is there, but mechanically, he just doesn't know how to control his body in space. Or vice versa. You can say, hey, like this is a project because this person just, they know how to get themselves in the right position, but they have terrible reactive strength. So that's something we can work on in the gym. I think that's where the field needs to sort of evolve to is being able to identify the limiting factor for performance. Is it technique or is it raw force production?
Man, I feel like we kind of make strength coach's life harder. Like years ago, we told them like do counter movement jump, and then after that, like oh drop jump. Now we need to break down films. Like
Well, yes and no, and I think that's what we're hoping to evolve with this project is making that process easier. And I think that's what technology should do is helping you collect force plate data and hopefully get motion capture at the same time. And now what we want to do with the on-court stuff is because the reason why it took us 4 years to put this paper out is because we had to synchronize all of the footage of every single repetition with the raw data from the LPS system. And so what we want to be able to do um, is take that software that we created and maybe make it available online. So potentially practitioners can upload their film data and their raw LPS data, and then they can automatically tag what action is being done. So we only had four potential options, but Tanuj, who we call the wizard, he created the software. And essentially, you can create thresholds of when a rep is triggered from the LPS data. So once you see accelerations above a certain threshold, 2 meters per second squared, it's going to cut 5 seconds of footage. And so you can have someone on the back end of that who sees, okay, what's the drill or what's the individual rep that's happening here? And they can tag that. And now suddenly you, as a practitioner, instead of, it took me about 20 minutes to process a single rep before I had that. You can do that much quicker. And now you have this massive database of sort of these kinetic outputs paired with the, technical and kinematic performance of that. So hopefully that's what excites us about this paper is less of the specific findings because it was small sample size, only 6 weeks of training, but more of just this framework of enabling practitioners to measure high intensity actions easier. And I think that's where the field needs to evolve to is exactly what you said. Like we can't, a lot of strength coaches do five jobs at once anyway, and a lot of sports scientists do five jobs at once. So we need to simplify the experience, and also having, ourselves not chase down rabbit holes of signals that aren't worth looking into.
nice, nice. So uh, another question related to like this change of direction is research is I remember uh in our research we had like 20 I think 120 something subjects
Wow.
and uh if you only look at the numbers we actually had a few ACL tear and the way they change like the numbers like really good in terms of like counter movement jump like linear or lateral change of direction the numbers like really good they perform like really well right is that kind of the like do you kind of see that in your research or
You mean you had athletes who had previously torn their ACL
no no
who
no they
were,
actually tore ACL after we like collect the data and we go back and look at the numbers all those numbers are like literally pretty well.
oh, the outputs you're saying like performance outputs, but did you look at, the kinematics of any of these moves or no?
No, not really.
I think injury stuff is not my forte on the, especially in the house of P3. There was Eric and Marcus and Trent uh focusing on the injury stuff. I've always been more interested in performance, but the only thing I will say is, injury prediction and modeling I think is, really challenging, but the same way kinetics are only not going to take you too far when it comes to identifying performance qualities where kinematics are involved. I think movement strategy for, risk of injury is, probably as important as, previous injury to the area or like major strength deficits between limbs. I think if you're constantly loading a strategy that's placing more stress on a potentially compromised ligament, then I can see why that would happen. So I think that's where the field can maybe evolve with these markerless motion capture technologies is to be able to, if you can get it better, if you can get this data more reliable, over time you can see what are the movement strategies associated with the 24 ACL injuries that we had this season. So I hope that's something we can find down the road, but I think there's a lot of opportunity on the table from the performance side that doesn't have to deal with markerless motion capture, that I hope we tried to outline here.
Nice, nice. Um, so like outside of like this research, is there like future research you're like gonna publish?
Yeah, so this one that we just put out was again looking at it was one of four, looking at the transfer from this, vertical and horizontal testing. We have three other ones that I think I'm going to defend my PhD in the next couple of weeks, if not months. And I might just put all four of them in sort of like a preprint just to sort of get them out there. And then maybe see if we want to publish some of those individually. But those papers are looking more at these cross-sectional relationships again. So CMJ and ADA in the lab, and then LCMJ and shuffling performance. And then it's looking at the transfer of lateral performance and lateral acceleration on court. And so I can, topically talk about some of the key findings there, but that hasn't gone through any peer review yet, if you want me to.
Man, I remember like I think last time I talked to you, I was like, man, I feel like our re like the research I did with Adam was so cool because we literally like compare vertical like XYZ axis of deceleration, right? And then after I talked to you, I was like, man, you guys' research are way cooler than ours because you compare like you compare on-court performance, right? We didn't do that.
It's very different. I mean, there's pros and cons to everything, and I think it's great that more research is coming out. I mean, you mentioned you had 124 subjects in this training study. We had 25. So the statistical power of what you guys can be able to ask on a cross-sectional view, with a very like understudied elite population, I think will be like a really meaningful contribution to literature. And I hope that people can build on what we did. I don't think this is the holy grail, but I'm glad you think it was valuable because it took up, a good 5 years of my life.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm glad it wasn't all for naught.
Yeah. So, all right. So after this, like change direction or like lateral shuffle or XRZ axis deceleration, what are some topics you're still interested in right now?
Oh, that's a good question. So now I work for Tonal, so a lot of my uh you know, thoughts that keep me up at night are about making training more accessible and scaling personalization. So that's sort of the where I put a lot of my time. But on the basketball side, I have sort of this grand vision in my head of being able to kind of like what I was saying before, but take this framework of automatically segmenting individual high intensity actions on court and being able to, again, automate that process. So there's a world where you and your team, maybe you can do an index assessment every day. If you do the same three drills to start your practice, is there a world where you can automate this process and you can start to complement some of your other readiness and your force play data with actual on-court outcomes to see sort of changes over time. But then I think you can also build on that to have a different profile, understanding your athletes on, in different uh, environments on court and to see where their strengths and weaknesses are, and then even get to the point of, being able to, as like a scouting tool, understanding strengths and weaknesses of like your own athlete's acceleration and deceleration profile in different tactical situations, and maybe how that matches up against an opponent. And so if there's like a high pressure situation and you have this data and maybe 2 minutes left in the clock and you say, hey, in this environment, I think this player is our best, defensive, you know, uh, component who can guard that person. So I think it's a long way of saying I think there is a lot of and even mapping game outcomes to acceleration and deceleration performance as well. So you can see like do any execution of these situations improve your ability to get a stop or get an offensive um, point. Uh, and sorry, I'll shut up. But also understanding game speed better too, because I think there's this notion of maximal acceleration and maximal deceleration. And while I think we always have to prepare athletes for the most demanding scenario, I think it'd be helpful to understand, okay, maybe for this player archetype, they only go, or in these offensive situations, they need to be able to go from 80% to 40% really fast, or they need to be able to go from 30 to 70 and just have a better understanding of like to what extent are these players tapping into their maximal abilities, is all sort of under this umbrella of automatically segmenting individual high intensity actions is where I'm interested in. So if I do anything else in this space, it would be, just to create that environment for other practitioners to pool their data so we can sort of, be more in this open science space and answer that question together because I can't put another 5 years into this on my own.
All right. Last question before I let you go. So, you've been with the New Yankees as a performance scientist. You've been with P3 as a sports scientist, right? So, pro baseball organization, and like super high level uh private sector P3. What are some like advice you can give to like young practitioner out there? Maybe
Hmm.
they just graduated from like college, master. They're looking to like go be a sports scientist somewhere.
Yeah, I think the one thing is go wherever you're going to get the most opportunity to develop. I was fortunate that the Yankees were looking for an assistant at the time. But P3, I knew like they had exposure to force plates, motion capture, top level athletes, top level training, and they had a lot of context. So that's what drew me there. And that might not be the pro baseball team. That might not be the pro basketball team. If there's a high performing private sector or a great college team and there's people who you can learn from, like prioritize that because what matters more than the names on your resume is sort of the skills you can accumulate at each of these stops. So I would start with that, just understand what skills you have, what skills you don't, and then maybe try to find a place to sort of complement it. So if you have experience with force plates, but you don't have experience with motion capture, maybe instead of trying to apply for a job in the NBA, you go to a college that has a motion capture lab. And then now you've become a more attractive candidate for that next position. So it's, identify the job you want in 3, 5, or 10 years down the road, understand the experiences and the specific skills that you might need to have if it's GPS, force plates, motion capture, actual training, or the ability to code if you have that kind of brain. And then it's sort of identifying places you can slowly grab all of those. And when you're in the individual environments, it's just not being selfish and having this mentality of like, how can I help the people around me? Because a lot of times that's what I've seen peers and who I've come up with, but you can tell when people are very selfish and they're just thinking about this as a stepping stone versus like, I'm actually going to try to bring value. And I'm not saying I brought the most value or I'm the most talented, but like that was my focus when I was at in Tampa or the Yankees or P3 was like, how can I help the people around me? And ultimately, they're gonna teach you more if that's your mentality, and then you're gonna be able to move on after that. So I hope that, yeah, is helpful and not
Yeah.
rambling.
Yeah. So one last question. What are your future goals since you kind of
Oh, wow.
mentioned that?
Um, my future goals. Well, I feel weird saying this, but I really like the opportunity at Tonal. Um, just because I think a perfect example is at P3 the basketball paper we put out, I think, had 128 subjects, and this one had 25. And at Tonal last year, we had over 300, I think, 50,000 active members at one point or another. And so now I feel like I'm in a position to, have a bigger impact on people's lives, and especially, like I applied at Tonal because I saw it was a way to, help grandparents lift their grandkids, and be healthier. And my parents are grandparents now, so that's something that's very motivating for me is to sort of give back in that sense. So I'd like to stay in this industry and environment as long as I can, but I also would like to contribute on the research side as well. So I guess yeah, I feel pretty fortunate to say I'm doing what I want right now, but we'll see as things evolve and change over time. It's been a long road to get here, and I'm sure in a couple of years things might change. But for now, yeah, I'm not looking anywhere.
Nice, nice.